Hello. Today we're going to look at, in simple terms, the basics of pollination. So what is pollination exactly? Well, it's basically the transfer of genetic material from male parts of flowers via pollen, which is the little capsule of genetic material, to female parts of flowers, so that the female parts are fertilized and can produce seed and, in some cases, fruit. Let's look at things in a little bit more detail. We're going to take a look at a diagram. Now, one thing I'd like to underline at this point is I'm going to minimize the use of complicated botanical terms and so on, because I want this video to be as understandable as possible for the maximum number of people. So if I do accidentally lapse and use some fancy botanical terms, I apologize in advance, but I will explain them during the video. So let's take a look at the diagram. Well, here we have a diagram where I've coloured the male parts of a flower in red and the female parts are in blue. And next to it we have a picture of actually a flower from an apple tree, and here I've marked what the male parts and female parts actually look like. And we can see in the picture also this kind of yellow powder, which is actually the pollen, this little capsule of genetic material from the male plant. Pollen quite often is a yellow or orange colour, but it can be any colour of the rainbow. Although pollen to us just looks like a kind of yellowy orange dust, under the microscope it has different shapes and sizes depending on the species of plant. So it's actually what we call species specific. So that means that tomatoes can only pollinate tomatoes, apple trees can only pollinate other apple trees, etc. We can't have tomatoes pollinating apple trees or apple trees pollinating anything else. Now, let's look at flowers. Now, the example I looked at had both male and female parts in our diagram, and we looked at an example which was actually a flower from an apple tree. But flowers can actually just have male parts, so we call them male flowers, and certain flowers can just have female parts, so we call them female flowers. And like in our example, we also have flowers which have male and female parts, which we can call bisexual. Now, on a plant, what kinds of plants have what kinds of flowers? Things start getting a little bit more complicated now. Well, there are certain types of plants which will have either on a particular specimen just male flowers or just female flowers. Things like holly and even the humble stinging nettle will have plants which are either with male flowers or plants with female flowers. We have other plants where they have individually male flowers and female flowers. The courgette or zucchini, as our American friends will call them, will have male and female flowers on the same plant. So they're separate flowers, but found on the same plant. And then we have other flowers, as we've seen, such as the apple, where the flower is bisexual. It has male and female parts in the same flower. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, things can be mixed up a little bit. We can have plants which have male flowers and bisexual flowers on the same plant, or female flowers and bisexual flowers on the same plant, or a combination of all three. We can have a plant that has purely male flowers and purely female flowers, and these bisexual flowers which have both parts too. So it's a bit of a minefield, isn't it? So how do we navigate through all these different types of flowers, male, female, bisexual and so on? Well, the best thing to do is when you buy a plant or plant a seed, check with the garden centre or on internet whether that particular plant needs a pollinator. This is why so often we plant more than one individual of a particular type of plant. Let's use an example just to illustrate this. If you want to have a holly tree with lots of red berries on it, holly trees are actually in two types. You have male holly trees and female holly trees. So the female holly trees have female flowers and the male holly trees have male flowers. And to have berries, which in fact are the fruit of the female holly tree, it needs to be pollinated by a male holly tree. So if you buy a female holly tree, you have to ensure that somewhere nearby, and when I say nearby, within probably 50 yards, say 50 meters, there is a male holly tree which can provide the pollen to pollinate your female holly tree so that it can produce these lovely red berries and seeds. But as I said, the best thing to do when you plant anything, if you're not sure, just ask. That's all very well, you say, but how on earth does pollen get from male parts of flowers to female parts of flowers, particularly if we've got plants which only have male flowers and the nearest plant with female flowers is maybe a little distance away? Well, there are lots of ways of transferring the pollen, but I'm going to look at the two most common. Now, the first one is this. It can be wind. As we've seen, pollen is this dust-like substance, which in fact is made up of lots and lots of microscopic little pollen grains. And these pollen grains can be blown by the wind from the male parts of flowers to the female parts of flowers. This is common with things like corn. And this is one reason why we plant corn not in thin lines, but often in what we call blocks, where there's lots of corn stems growing near each other, such that whichever direction the wind is blowing will blow some of this pollen from the male parts of the plant, which are at the top, down onto a neighbouring female part of a flower on a neighbouring plant. So that's wind. That's one thing. Now the other common method is using little organisms to carry the pollen from one male part of a flower to a female part of a flower. Things like insects. So we all think of things such as bees, for example, which are very well known for this, but many insects will carry the pollen from male parts of flowers to female parts of flowers. We have bees, but we have lots of other insects which all fulfill this role. But also we have things like bats and birds too for certain flowers. So what happens is the organism visits a male flower, rubs up against the male parts which have the pollen, because the visiting organism is looking for nectar. Flowers have this way of bribing these messengers by giving them a nice liquid meal, which is kind of sugary, which attracts them. So, for example, the bee is there for the nectar, but in searching for the nectar, it rubs up against the male parts of the flower and gets coated in pollen. And then when it visits a female part of a neighbouring flower, the pollen may well fall off the furry exterior of the bee onto the female parts of the flower, and so pollinate it and fertilise it so that it can produce seeds and possibly fruit. So now we see why these little insects and birds and bats are so extremely important for us, because they are the ones that do the job of transporting pollen from male to female plants. And this is how we can ensure that we get good crops of fruit and vegetables, because we have this little army of helpers doing the job of transporting the pollen. Now, a common question is this: can a plant fertilise itself? Now, if we think of some plants that have male and female flowers, or these plants that have bisexual flowers, can the pollen of that plant fertilise itself? Now, there are certain plants where the answer is yes. For example, a tomato. A tomato has bisexual flowers, which has both male and female parts, and the pollen from the male parts can fertilise the female parts and then produce seeds and tomatoes. Here I am going to use a term, so forgive me in advance, but this is called auto-fertility. It just means that the plant can fertilise itself. Now, there are other plants, and again we saw with our example and our diagram, we saw a picture of a flower from an apple tree. Now, this also has bisexual flowers, so it has male and female parts, but it has mechanisms in place, which we're not going to go into, which actually blocks self-fertilization, self-pollination. So this apple tree cannot fertilize itself, and it's called what we say auto-sterile. It's automatically sterile, it cannot pollinate itself. So in the case of an apple tree, we always have to ensure there is at least another apple tree that can pollinate it nearby somewhere. Going back to our tomatoes, which are actually auto-fertile, there is a little trick which is quite useful. If you tap the little flowers of the tomato plant, this will quite often dislodge a bit of pollen from the male parts to the female parts, which will ensure that it's pollinated. So it may improve your crop. So if you've only got one or two or three or a little handful of tomato plants, you can go around and just tap gently each of the flowers to dislodge the pollen and produce lots and lots of tomatoes. This won't work with the apple tree because, as we know, it's auto-sterile and it needs another pollinating apple tree nearby to ensure the pollination between the two different plants. So, as we've seen, pollination is important for the production of a number of different fruits and plants that we like to enjoy in the garden. Such things as apples, pears, plums, cherries and so on, squashes, tomatoes and things like that. There are other plants where we're not really too worried about the production of fruit and seeds, such as leaf vegetables, things like cabbages and lettuces and so on, where they don't need to be pollinated because we're actually going to eat the leaves and not really interested in things like seeds or fruit. Now, there is one last thing I'm going to mention to finish on. I promise not to use long words, but I'm just going to use one here, so please forgive me. It's a thing called parthenocarpy, and it's quite interesting because certain plants will produce fruit without the seeds, without being pollinated. And this is very much the case of the persimmon, which is a wonderful fruit which I adore. I have a persimmon tree in the garden, and it doesn't have another plant nearby to pollinate it. It produces female flowers, and if they're not pollinated, it won't produce seeds, but it will still produce fruit without seeds. So that's one of those lovely exceptions which proves the rule. But in general, for most fruits and certain other plants that I've mentioned, we need pollination to ensure that the fruits are produced. So there we are. Pollination, I hope, certainly in a digestible form. If you want to improve your knowledge on pollination, of course, it can get far more complicated than that, and you can do a little bit of homework on internet or talk to knowledgeable botanists and gardeners if you wish to certainly deepen your understanding of pollination. But I hope, as an introduction, we've covered the most important points. So, happy gardening!